The Life of Dwight L. Moody, Chapter 43, Traits and Characteristics. Of some prominent preachers it has been said that when you see them in the pulpit you wish they might never leave it, and when you see them out of it you wish they might never enter it. This could never be said of D. L. Moody. His character could bear a rigid examination, as one of his closest friends said. Doubtless he had faults, but I never saw them. If his preaching was persuasive in the pulpit while addressing thousands, it was in the quiet seclusion of his home life or in the companionship of a few warm friends that he was most truly eloquent. Impulsive, energetic, and resolute by nature, he had possessed in a great degree the quiet strength of patience, sympathy, and unselfishness. To the stranger, his most prominent characteristic was enthusiasm. Like the Apostle Paul, he could say, "For me to live is Christ," and as a result of that life, his gain came at the end of Earth's career. This one thing I did was the key to his life of service. Writing to Major Whittle in 1874 from Scotland, he said, "I have done one thing on this trip, and the work is wonderful. One thing is my motto." Nothing could swerve him from this deep-rooted purpose of his life, and in all the various educational and publishing projects to which he gave his energy, there was but one motive, the proclamation of the gospel through multiplied agencies. But all this enthusiasm was perfectly controlled by what was perhaps his most remarkable quality, quoted before as his consecrated common sense. While his enthusiasm prompted him to seize every available opportunity for work, it was his keen insight into the conditions of any occasion that enabled him to judge of its fitness for his special effort. For this reason, he frequently stood out against the advice of his friends, not that he did not welcome advice and appreciate it, but its value to him was chiefly suggestive, and if no new view of the matter was offered, it was not likely to be followed. To such an extent is this true that it may be said safely that in the beginning of all his greatest and most successful efforts he stood alone, acting against the advice of those best able, apparently, to judge of the matter, with the one exception of his most valued human adviser, the companion of his life, his wife. He entered into his first campaign in Great Britain amongst the counsel of all his friends against the advice of everybody. He guaranteed the financial liability of the first publication of the Moody and Sankey hymns. The Northfield schools and Chicago Bible Institute were established in the face of great opposition and were the subject of much criticism until they demonstrated their success. And as to the founding of the Corporate Association, it was generally felt that in this work at least, Mr. Moody had exceeded the limits of his strength. But in all these cases, as in many others, the results have not only surprised his advisers, but have far surpassed even the founder's expectations. To many men of less simplicity of heart, such evident superiority of judgment would have resulted in an intolerable conceit. But although Mr. Moody was self-reliant, or, more truthfully, God-radiant, he was humble to a degree. It never ceased to be a wonder to him that people wanted to hear him preach, and at the Northfield Conference it was only after repeated and most urgent requests that he could be induced to incline himself among the speakers. "I haven't the cheek to get up and speak when all these great preachers are here," he would say to reply to the urgent invitations. The well-known head of a prominent lecture bureau relates that being in Chicago with Henry Ward Beecher at the time Mr. Moody was president of the association, he requested him to introduce Beecher on the evening of the lecture for which he was engaged. "What?" responded Mr. Moody. "Introduce Beecher? Not I. Ask me to black his boots and I'll gladly do it." It is well known that Mr. Moody was much impressed by Mr. Beecher's great power as a preacher, and believed he might very likely extend his influence, especially over young men. With this in view, he visited Brooklyn and urged with great persistency that Mr. Beecher should give himself to evangelistic efforts. It is asserted that the suggestion was actually considered by Mr. Beecher, and for a time he seriously contemplated such work. Towards the close of the early mission in Brooklyn, Mr. Moody was interviewed by a representative of the secular press, to whose inquiry regarding his training for evangelistic work, he made this characteristic response: "I am the most overestimated man in this country. For some reason, the people look upon me as a great man, but I am only a lay preacher and have little learning. I don't know what will become of me if the newspapers continue to print all of my sermons. My stock will be exhausted by and by, and I must repeat old ideas and teachings." Brooklyn hears every Sunday a score of better sermons than I can preach. I cannot get up such sermons as Dr. Scores, that's S-T-O-R-R-S, and Buddington, and Kyler, and Talmadge, and many others who preach here week after week. Mr. Moody's abhorrency of any appearance of obsequiousness was frequently in evidence. So pronounced was this aversion that at times he would take special precautions against being introduced to a person of a special note who might have attended his meetings. Speaking on one occasion in Washington, a person of particular distinction was seated on the platform behind Mr. Moody. After the service, he specially avoided an introduction, explaining afterwards that there were a lot of people scraping and going around, and I know much on that line. On one of his earlier trips abroad, it is related that he received a most impressive introduction to some lord he was beginning the service in a crowded hall. "Glad to meet you, Lord," was a grotesque announcement. "Won't you please give those two old ladies a seat down there in the middle aisle," pointing to the two women who had just entered. But with all this strong aversion to an approach of servitude, Mr. Moody was an avid hero worshiper. Seldom could he speak of Abraham Lincoln without tears, and he had a great favorite fund of anecdotes illustrating the nobility of his character. In much the same spirit, he would speak of Robert E. Lee, U.S. Grant, Stonewall Jackson, and William E. Gladstone. Nor did he limit his admiration to those who had passed beyond public criticism, but ardently expressed his regard for the statesmen then making the nation's history. President McKinley he considered to be the peer of Lincoln and Grant, and during the dark days of weighty responsibility attending the Spanish-American War, the chief executive had no sympathizers who remembered him more earnestly in prayer or more enthusiastically praising the worship which distinguished his policy. It has been noted that Moody frequently determined upon a course that he did not appear wise to his friends. This meant that their perceptive was confused by what appeared to be insurmountable obstacles. Such obstructions never obscured Mr. Moody's vision, for if once he thought an object worth obtaining, he undertook its achievement with an enthusiasm and vigor equally only by his determined perseverance. It was this last trait that contributed largely to his success. Many of his enterprises would have been abandoned by a less courageous and persistent character. For him, obstacles were only an incentive to greater efforts. "I hate the word can't," he would say. "When a man says, 'you can't,' it always makes me want to prove that I can." The beauty of nature was an unending source of delight to him. Northfield is famous for its natural scenery, and mountain drives through the surrounding country reveal new beauties with every change in season. It was on these lovely excursions that Mr. Moody would confide to his most intimate friends his deep secrets and most cherished purposes. The surroundings seemed to influence him powerfully, and often on these drives he would suddenly break off his conversation and, reining in the horse, pour out his heart in praise to God for his mercies, or unburden his soul in a simple prayer for guidance or relief. The very spontaneity of such prayers revealed the atmosphere of his life, which was one of constant communion with God. It was not surprising then that he should seldom have long seasons of agonizing prayer, such as some have experienced, for his closeness to God was not limited to special seasons, but was a continuous and uninterrupted experience. Intense conviction and determined concentration upon the one thing he did absorbed him, and he often gained a reputation for briskness. After a service conducted in a spirit of deep earnestness, he was not the man to enter into a conversation over trifling things with one who claimed an acquaintance of a dozen years back. Or if, on such an occasion, some dampy young theological student would hinder him in dealing with an anxious inquirer by accosting him with an inquiry as to the secret of his power, it was more than probable that a very apparent briskness would appear in his manner. He had little sympathy with controversy of any sort and any habitual disturbers of Christian unity, and he never allowed himself to be hindered by cranks of either sex, from long-haired men and short-haired women. "Good Lord, deliver us," was a part of his latency. On one occasion, after a morning session of the August Conference, a man upbraided him for not teaching the doctrine of holiness. "Why, I have not sinned for years," claimed the stranger. "Haven't you?" said Mr. Moody. "Well, before I accept your word for it, I would like the testimony of your wife. The perfectionist, therefore, thereupon gave such an exhibition of temper as to warrant the spectator's sympathy for his wife and Moody's skepticism. It was often remarked that Moody had a wonderful gift of intuition by which he would readily make a wise decision. This would at first seem to be so, but such an impression was in reality the result of a superficial knowledge of the man. His conclusions were readily made by rapid deduction. Experience had crystallized into a few clearly defined laws and established certain criteria. This was illustrated perhaps as well by his quick and precise estimate of the capacity of a hall or church as by any other means. Such an estimate is very hard to make offhand, and it is extraordinary how difficult it is to secure reliable data on the subject, even those best able to judge being inclined to greatly overestimate the figures. The old Illinois street church was just 100 by 50, and I always measured everything in my mind by that, was the explanation of his unerring accuracy in this line. And even when examining the largest audience rooms, he always referred to the church where he first had an experience in building. On much the same principle, he judged character at first sight, and it was an exceptional case where his first impression was wrong. When you shake hands with a man, look out for him. If his hand is as limp as a dead fish, was his frequent warning. At another time, he warned against those who tell all they know at the first acquaintancy. In public speaking, his method of judging his audience was of the same nature. I always select a few people in the audience here and there to whom I speak. If I can interest them and hold their attention, I have the entire audience. If any of these go to sleep or loses interest, I work to secure the attention of that one. Mr. Moody was rich in friends whom he had found in all parts of America and Great Britain. Of their confidence and regard for him there is no need to speak, as the work which they enabled him to establish and maintain at Northfield and Chicago most clearly indicates their appreciation of his aims and judgment. For 20 years, he raised an average of over $100,000 annually for the support of his several enterprises. In addition, over $1 million was invested in the permanent equipment of the schools, and many hundreds of thousands was secured by him during his public life for incidental undertakings in behalf of the Young Men's Christian Association and other organizations. Any real friendship he counted a special blessing, not to be held lightly. It has been said, however, that few of his friends enjoyed any very great degree of intimacy. This is partly true, and a few men ever entered into that close inner circle of fellowship in which he would lay bare the innermost secrets of his soul. There were a few of those, however, whose friendship he knew to be true, and among these was Henry Drummond, for whom Moody had a love, as he himself expressed it, like that which David felt for Jonathan. The mutual regard of these two men, so different both in nature and in training, was most significant of the breadth of charity in both. Moody, who loved Drummond as a brother and appreciated his deep spirituality, would say of him, "He was the most Christ-like man I ever knew." Drummond, who knew and thoroughly appreciated Mr. Moody as few have done, testified to his friend's character in equally vivid terms. In the course of a short biographical sketch of Moody in McClure's magazine, he gave the following appreciation. Simple as this man is, and homely as are his surroundings, probably America possesses at this moment no more extraordinary personage, not even among the most brilliant of her sons, has any one rendered more stupendous or more enduring service to his country or his time. No public man is less understood, especially by the thinking world, than D.L. Moody. It is not that it is unaware of his existence or that it does not respect him, but his line is so special, his work has lain so apart from what it conceives to be the rational channels of progress that it has never felt called upon to take him seriously. So little indeed is the true stature of this man known to the mass of his generation that the preliminary estimate recorded here must seem both extravagant and ill-considered. It will surprise many to know that Mr. Moody is as different from the supposed type of his class as light is from darkness, that while he would be the last to repudiate the name, indeed while glorifying more and more every day. He lives in the work of an evangelist. He sees the weaknesses, the narrownesses, the limitations of that order with as clear an eye as the most unsparing of its critics. But especially will it surprise many to know that while preaching to the masses has been the main outward work of Mr. Moody's life, he has perhaps more and more buried irons in the fires, educational, philanthropic, religious, than almost any living man, and that vast as has been his public work as a preacher to the masses, it is probably true that his personal influence and private character have done as much as his preaching to affect his day and generation, whether estimated by the moral qualities which go to making up of his personal character or the extent to which he has impressed these on whole communities of men on both sides of the Atlantic. There is, perhaps, no more truly great man living than D.L. Moody. I have met multitudes and personally known in large numbers men and women of all churches and creeds, of many countries and ranks, from the poorest to the richest, from the most ignorant to the wisest, upon whom he has placed an ineffaceable moral mark. There is no large town in Great Britain, and I find that there are very few in America where this man has not gone, where he has not lived for days, weeks, or months, and where he has not left behind him personal inspirations which live on to this day, inspirations that from the moment of their birth have not ceased to evidence themselves in furthering domestic happiness and peace, in charities and philanthropics, in social, religion, and even municipal and national service. From those who had opportunity of knowing him best through close and constant companionship come the most unreserved and spontaneous testimony to Mr. Moody's simple, open, and selfish character. Mr. Sankey's experience would be largely the record of this entire work, but in the following he had epitaphed his impressions. One of the greatest compliments to his preaching was that the sermon that would hold the rapt attention of the most intellectual of his congregation would also be listened to with the same eagerness by the children present. Everyone understood what he said. His meaning was clear to every child. It was also convincing to the old. No other preacher ever mastered this art. If anything connected with Mr. Moody may be called an art of reaching the understanding of old and young at the same time. His simplicity of language was remarkable. The strong individuality of the man spoke out in every sentence. The beauty of his powerful nature shone in his works. One of the reasons of his phenomenal success in bringing souls to God was that he believed absolutely, implicitly, in the message he gave to men. His faith was the faith of a little child. No doubts ever dimmed his faith in the Word of God. To him it was the truth and the whole truth. He never sat down and folded his hands and waited for the Lord to bring about what he wanted. He did not believe in passive Christianity. Mr. Moody never tried to exalt himself, never thought of himself. He made no attempt to find speeches or rhetorical phrasing. He once said, Christ talked in parables. Oh, how I wish I could talk in parables. I would if I knew enough. His simple, direct manner of work has often been described. His tremendous earnestness, his indomitable energy, his lovable personality, and above all and through all, his thorough kindness won him the hearts of millions. No one could meet him without admiring him. No one could know him without loving him. The rich, the learned, the poor, the happy, and the miserable, convicts shut in by iron bars, and the great ones of earth, alike found that he had a message for each. Now the world grieves that one of the noblest souls of earth has passed beyond our ken. Our comfort lies in the fact that one day, when the mist have rolled away, we will meet him again. One of Mr. Moody's most effective helpers in later years was Professor D.B. Towner, who was associated with him for the last 14 years of his life, beginning with the Cincinnati meetings in the fall of 1885. After that time, Professor Towner had changed of the music at all the college conferences. Professor Towner had charge of the music at all the college conferences. He also attended several of the August conferences, assisting Sankey and Stebbins in the singing. Since 1893, he has been connected with the Bible Institute. In speaking to Mr. Moody, he said, "During all these years, there has never been the slightest misunderstanding between us, and I have never met a man who came so nearly to Christ's standard as he. He was absolutely unselfish, always sharing everything with his helpers and looking after their comfort with the care and tenderness of a father. Never in the 14 years that I have been associated with him has he said an unkind word or given me an unkind look. My own father could not have been more kind or solicitous for my comfort and welfare. My love for him was stronger than for any man in the world, and his influence on my life for good has been greater than that of any 10 men that I have ever known. I never knew such a friend, and shall never cease to thank God that I had a privilege to know him and labor with him. After his meetings in Oakland, California in the spring of 1899, when I accompanied him as a singer, he took the train for Santa Cruz. We were hardly seated when in came a party of young men, one of whom was considerably under the influence of liquor, and very badly bruised, with one eye completely closed and terribly discolored. He at once recognized Mr. Moody and began to sing hymns and talk very loudly for his benefit. Mr. Moody caught up his bag and said, "Towner, let us get out of this." When I reminded him the other car was full, he settled down, protesting that the company should not allow a drunken man to insult the whole car in such a manner. Presently the conductor came, and Mr. Moody called his attention to the poor fellow in the rear of the car. The conductor attended to his duty, and when he reached the young man, he said a few words to him in a low voice, and the fellow followed him into the baggage car, where he bathed his eye and bound it up with his handkerchief, after which the young man soon fell asleep. Mr. Moody sat musing for a time, and then said, "Towner, that is an awful rebuke to me. I preached against Pharisaism last night to a crowd, and exhorted them to imitate the Good Samaritan. And now this morning, God has given me an opportunity to practice what I preach, and I find I have put feet in the shoes of the priest and Levite." He was sent all the way to Santa Cruz, but he told the incident that night to an audience, confessing his humiliation. During the Columbian campaign in Chicago, Mr. Moody used to preach to the Haymarket Theater on the west side. One night the crowd came early, and he closed the meeting before the cab came to take him to his rooms in the Bible Institute. Starting down Madison Street on foot, knowing he would make the cab, he had not gone far when he was accosted by a rough-looking fellow who asked him for money. Mr. Moody told him that he did not have a cent with him. The stranger seemed rather cross, began to complain about the way he was treated, and said he was starving and must have some money. Mr. Moody did not care to proceed any further for fear he might follow and give him trouble, so he entered into a conversation with him, and presently the cab drove up. "Lend me $1, said Moody to the driver. "Certainly, Mr. Moody," was the reply. At this remark, the tramp said, "Is this Moody, the evangelist?" Mr. Moody said it was, and that he had just been preaching at the Haymarket, at the same time handing him $1 the driver had put into his hands. But the poor fellow drew back, saying, No, my father is a poor Methodist preacher, and I will starve before I take a penny from you, Mr. Moody." On another occasion, he came upon a crowd of rough fellows. He did not want to seem to shun them, and yet he did not care to go through the crowd. So, stepping boldly up to a big burly fellow who seemed to be the leader, he said, "Won't you please hold my coat for me?" And to another, "Would you just hold my Bible?" After the coat was on, he said, "Thank you, gentlemen. When you get old and stiff, I hope someone will be as kind to you." It is needless to say that he could pass through safely then. But while Mr. Moody was a devoted friend, he was not the man to condone a fault in any one he loved. On occasion he had severed relations with one whom he believed to be wrong, though this often caused him such suffering as only a true and loyal heart can feel. On the other hand, he would make any personal sacrifice to help a friend, and on occasions have not been wanting where he had stood by a friend in difficulty at the expense of great personal loss, necessitating more than temporal inconveniences. The home above all other places is where a man most truly reveals himself, and here Mr. Moody was at his best. Home was the sweetest place upon earth to him, and had he chosen only his own comfort and pleasure, he would have devoted his last years to work at Northfield in connection with the schools without heeding the calls of service to the outer world. Entering into all the plans and interested in everything which demanded the attention of the members of his family, he made their life his own. A child's pleasures afforded him keen enjoyment. The student's school or college experience enlisted his hearty sympathy. His advice in business affairs or even domestic problems was most highly valued. Nothing was too trifling for his notice, and in the home and community he became the great burden-bearer. Of later years, it was his custom to spend the months from October to April, inclusively, in evangelistic work, returning to Northfield about the 1st of May. There was no place he loved more than this, and he always regretted to have to leave it, even for short absences during the summer months. His correspondence was always large, and he made it a point to open every letter himself. Inquiries connected with the different schools were separated and given to subordinates, and certain general letters were usually handed to his secretary. In special cases, he would indicate by brief notes what reply should be made. Letters received prompt attentions, even those from disagreeable people, were usually courteously acknowledged. In nothing, perhaps, is Mr. Moody generally more manifest than in his capacity for detail, wrote a friend. Nothing is too minute for his best thought, for he knows how much results depend on little things. Along with this genuineness for details goes remarkable quickness for insight and decision. The old proverb, a prophet is not without honor save in his own country, cannot be said of D.L. Moody, for surely no person could be more sincerely loved and honored by his townsmen than was he. Wrote a correspondence to the county paper and describing him as a citizen and a neighbor. Expressions of sorrow are heard from all classes of people in the town, and could each tribute be represented by a blossom on his grave, it would be piled high with flowers. His townsmen have been proud of him as a citizen, as a man, and as a religious worker. Although not all of them have endorsed his religious belief, they have thoroughly believed in his honesty of purpose and sincerity, and are convinced that the result of his life work will be lasting and of an inestimable value to future generations. They know that Northfield has been changed from a quiet farming town with corresponding disadvantages to a thrifty village with a steady growth, and that there and at Mount Hermon have been established two of the best-fitting schools in the state, all through the energy and perseverance of this man. Every effort has been made by him to bring these schools within the reach of the boys and girls of the town, and many an ambitious father and mother have been able to educate their children through his efforts. Last night he was told of a woman who was supporting her family by taking in washing. Her daughter was ready for the seminary, but she almost despaired of her ability to send her. Mr. Moody instantly replied, "Tell the principal to put her on the free list, and find her a room in the buildings. The town girls must be helped first." This is only one incident of many. Under certain provisions, a few years ago, he offered every Northfield and Gill boy free tuition for the first year at Mount Hermon, and several boys have availed themselves of this opportunity every year since. He was instantly alert and ready with money and work to forward any plans to benefit the town. At the time the Village Improvement Society was formed, he subscribed $100 to improve the street, knowing that it would be expended in a part of the village remote from the school and his residents. Every year since its formation, he has given generously of money and has also offered valuable advice and wise suggestions. He was very proud of the magnificent trees of the village, and nothing irritated him more than any attempts to injure them. He had a large number of trees and shrubs set about his place and on the seminary grounds. It must have been very gratifying to him to see Seminary Hill in all its June splendor, knowing that in his childhood it was considerable one of the most barren places in town. One old man once said that side hill wouldn't bear white beans when he was a boy. He was a kind neighbor, sickness and trouble finding him ready with sympathy and material help. The delicacies of his garden and fruit orchard found their way into many a humble home. He encouraged his wife and daughter to interest themselves in helping the sick and needy in all parts of the town. During the autumn, when fruit was abundant, the seminary girls were given free access to his orchard and grapery to eat and carry baskets full to their rooms. Each fall, all the surplus apples from his own orchard and from the seminary campus, and all he could solicit from neighboring towns to the extent of hundreds of bushels, were distributed among the poor in Boston and New York. He had a strong aversion to committees. A few months ago, an organization was being effected in the town hall, and a motion was made to appoint certain committees. Mr. Moody rose and said, "We don't want committees. When you want anything done, tell Mr. So-and-so to do it, and he will accomplish something. One is enough to constitute any committee. If there had been a committee appointed, Noah's Ark would never have been built." Mr. Moody was accused of lowering the pulpit by some people in Boston because he declared that the churches should seek those who did not seek the churches. His reply was, "If lowering the pulpit means bringing it to the people, I would to God I could. If I wanted to hit Boston, you don't think I would mount my guns on Bunker Hill Monument and set fire into the air, do you? On Sunday evening, April 21st, 1895, Mr. Moody was holding a meeting in a specially constructed building in the city of Fort Worth, Texas. The roof was flat and as it turned out, insignificantly supported. During one of the meetings, when the audience numbered about 4,000, heavy rain fell, and the water collected on the flat roof. In the very midst of Mr. Moody's sermon, a large crash was heard, and a large section of the roof over the middle of the vast auditorium fell in. I was sitting a little distance from the front, in company with a distinguished general of the Confederacy, said Dr. C.I. Schofield, at that time a pastor in Dallas, Texas. I was struck, as all present were, with the perfect presence of mind of Mr. Moody, and with the manner in which he held control of the audience, preventing the stampede, which would inevitably have resulted in great injury to them and possible loss of life. When quiet was restored, and the people had got safely out of the building, this general turned to me and said, Dr. Schofield, I have seen many brave men in my life put into positions of great personal danger, and I believe I know a brave man when I see him tested. I want to say to you that I have never seen a braver man than D.L. Moody. Mr. Moody was quick to take in a situation and prompt in giving an answer to what would require a good deal of thought and consideration on the part of many. Referring to an incident where this characteristic was marked, a friend said, I was very anxious to learn Mr. Moody's opinion on a certain minister, Dr. X, who had been spoken of as a desirable man for a pulpit then vacant. I ventured to say, Mr. Moody, confidentially, what is your opinion of Reverend Dr. X for such a pulpit? Mr. Moody rose from his seat, went to the window, and looked out for several minutes without saying a word. I feared that I had offended him. He then turned and said, there is too much tommyhawk about him. He resumed our pleasant conversation about other matters, and the subsequent history of that clergyman proved the correctness of Mr. Moody's judgment. Quite as interesting was the answer which a clergyman received who had gone to Northfield to interview Mr. Moody concerning a man whom he wished to procure for Christian work. When asked for the interview, the subject having been mentioned, Mr. Moody, without naming a time or making further explanations, said, get his boots if you can. They are better than most men's whole bodies. Mr. Moody had little regard for red tape and could not always be held to the requirements of parliamentary procedures. One afternoon, while the trustees of the seminary were considering ways and means, a member of the board was obliged to withdraw before the end of the meeting. He was about to enter his carriage when Mr. Moody raised a window and said, will you give $1,000 if I will do the same? All right, came the answer. Mr. Moody, as he closed the window, remarked that he did not have $1,000 himself, but he would raise it some way or another. In response, one of the trustees smilingly remarked that was a somewhat irregular proceeding, but Mr. Moody answered, oh well, we do everything up here differently from other people. Once while driving in the woods, he found a plank broken in the flooring of a small bridge. Returning, he called to one of the farm workers working on the hotel grounds and said, a plank is broken in the bridge. Describing the location, take a new one and go over and put it in. The man hesitated, then said, that bridge does not belong to our district. I know, said Mr. Moody, and my horse doesn't belong in that district either, but it might have broken its leg just the same. Mr. Moody was as careful of details as he was of great plans. While preaching, he would stop in the middle of his discourse, if necessary, and say, will the ushers please open the window and let in a little fresh air? It is getting close in here. And at another time, he would rouse the audience by saying, you are getting sleepy while I'm talking to you about assurance. I don't want you to think I'm a dull preacher. You need some fresh air. Then, after a few minutes' interval, shut the windows. I see they are putting on their wraps. Mr. Moody was averse to having his photograph taken, and only twice did he set for a picture alone after he began his evangelistic work. When his grandchildren were born, however, he was induced to reconsider his objections, and some of the best pictures of those in which he figures with one or another of the little ones. Bishop Huntington of the Diocese of Central New York came to Northfield in the early part of Mr. Moody's evangelistic ministry, as he said, to seek an interview. When I reached there, I found him pitching off a load of oats in the barn. In a serious and candid talk under a tree in the yard, he said some words which I have recalled and repeated many times. They were these: I know perfectly well that wherever I go and preach, there are many better preachers known and heard than I am. All that I can say about that, it is the Lord that uses me. That I take it with the faith of the Spirit of the whole extraordinary career and the sacred secret of His power. It was strong because He was simple. He prevailed and succeeded because He was genuine, because He was a willing instrument of the will of God. One morning He arose somewhat earlier than was His custom in order to study and prepare His address for the morning session of a students' conference. He went to the window and looked out to see if the indications were for a pleasant day. As he did so, he saw a student carrying a heavy valise, V-A-L-I-S-E. It was evident that the young man was on his way to the station to catch the early morning train. I had started to read my Bible, said Mr. Moody, in the speaking of a matter afterwards, but somehow I couldn't fasten my attention to the book. I could see before me as I read that young man trudging along with that heavy valise. Perhaps he had given the quarter that it would have cost him to ride to the station to the collection taken up at my request the day previous. Yes, and he had nearly 2 miles to walk. Surely that box must be heavy. I couldn't stand it any longer. I went to the barn and hurriedly had my horse hitched up and overtook the young man and carried him and his baggage to the station. When I returned to the house, I had no further difficulty in fixing my attention on the subject I was studying. He had the largest confidence in the medical profession, for, to use his own words, never yet in all my years of work have I called on an able doctor telling him of the sickness and need of some poor friend and some poor and friendless person that he did not at once go to the rescue without money and without price. These are the men who are called devils by their faith healers. God heals through doctors and medicine. Do you ask what it would do if I were ill? Did the best doctor in town trust in him and trust in the Lord to work through him? When special services were being held in the Congregational Church, he told the people they were not making enough effort to get their neighbors to come to church. Why don't you bring somebody in your big wagon, he said, advertising one well-to-do farmer by name. Because my wagon is always filled from my own house, was the reply. Mr. Moody at once said he must have a wagon, one way or another, adding that he wanted to invest $25 in one himself and called for contributions. People in the audience added $100 more, and later $80 additional was subscribed. This was the beginning of the church wagons that, in the summer season, were seen driving from the hotel and through the streets, carrying people to and from the services free of charge. One of the most trying positions into which Mr. Moody was frequently brought was that of a father confessor. It was quite impossible, even if it were desirable, to prevent persons with great burdens on conscience and heart making known their peculiar condition. One case of special interest occurred during the mission in St. Louis. A very gentlemanlike man called and confessed that he was a transgressor of the civil law. His crime was ever before him. If he confessed before the authorities, a commitment to the penitentiary for a long term would undoubtedly be the result. Mr. Moody, the man said, with deep emotion, I want your advice. I am willing to suffer for my sin, but I have a beautiful home, a devoted wife, several lovely children. A public confession means to ease disgrace and poverty. What is my duty before God? I have been forgiven by Him. I only desire to know what is the right course to pursue, and I believe I am willing to take it regardless of the consequences. Mr. Moody's heart was touched. He felt obliged to reply, My friend, I cannot undertake to advise you. You must go to God and ask Him. The next day the man again called and said, Mr. Moody, I do not think I need your advice now. I have fully determined what is right. I purpose giving myself up. He spent 1 week more with his wife and children, then placed himself in the hands of the law, and was sentenced for a long term. The wife was obliged to support herself and children, and this she did for some time. Mr. Moody endeavored without success to obtain a parole for the penitent. A few years later, he renewed his efforts. He was very hopeful and made a special trip to the state capitol to interview the governor. Mr. Moody was very courteously received, but when the object of his call was stated, the request was positively denied, and Mr. Moody returned home greatly saddened. Later, under another administration, a pardon was obtained, and the family are now happily reunited. The Reverend Dr. Henry Clay Trimble says that one element of Mr. Moody's power was his fearless independency in speech and manner. He dared to be himself, and he would never risk trying to be anybody else. When holding meetings in Baltimore in 1878, he telegraphed Dr. Trumbull asking if he would come down and aid in the work. The following incident connected with that visit is related by Dr. Trumbull. I went down and joined him in his meeting. and then passed the night in his temporal home. In the morning he asked me to conduct worship in his family group. I said I would read the passage for next Sunday's lesson. Zacchaeus the publican. Noticing my pronunciation of the proper name, he said, "Is that the way to call it?" "Yes," I said, the proper pronunciation is Zacchaeus. But we Yankees always start the emphasis a little too soon. Zacchaeus, said Moody, trying the word to his ear, and then added, "I guess I better stick to the old way." He measured himself aright as he did many others. Moody knew his power and knew his lack, and he had due regard for both. He never attempted what was outside of his limitations, but he was fearless in the use of what he had. Moody was no Oriental scholar, nor did he assume to give a Bible picture in its Eastern setting. But he did give the idea of the Bible scene as he had it in his mind, and as he wanted his hearers to have it in theirs. I once heard him telling the story of Daniel. Picture Daniel was taking out his watch to note the time as noon approaching, when he would pray as usual, lions or no lions. In his earnest, graphic, vivid way, he made that scene so real that no one thought of any anachronism on his part. So again, as he told the story of Noah's warning before the flood, he pictured the scoffers of that day while the deluge was delayed. They'd say to one another, "Not much sign of old Noah's rainstorm yet." They'd talk it over in the corner groceries evening. Then, as in an explanation, he said, "I tell you, my friends, before the world got as bad as it was in Noah's day, they must have had corner groceries." Everybody could understand that kind of thought. Yet Moody was a hard student, and he gained and grew steadily in intellect and knowledge as years went on. He told me of his surprise expressed by one man who found him in his study with his books open before him. "You don't mean, Moody, that you use commentaries, do you?" "Of course I do." "Then I shan't enjoy your sermons as I have, now that I know that." "Have you ever liked my sermons?" "Of course I have." "Then you have liked Moody's commentaries, haven't you?" The Reverend S.A. Taggart, State Secretary of the Young Men's Christian Association of Pennsylvania, accompanied Mr. Moody during a number of his meetings in that state and relates several characteristic incidents. He says, Mr. Moody had a fine sense of fitness of things. In one of the cities where meetings were being held, a prominent representative of Christian work called upon him. He was a very dignified man with a seeming air of wisdom and carried a fine gold-headed cane. I saw Mr. Moody looking at the cane, and it seemed to act as a sort of non-conductor of freedom of intercourse. After the man had gone, he said to me, why don't you carry a gold-headed cane?" I told him I did not have enough dignity. "Why don't you carry one?" I said. He replied, "I would cut a fine figure coming into an inquiry room tonight with one. I think the inquirers would be looking more at the cane than listening to me." A good while ago, I was down in the South, and a delegation waited on me and presented me with such a cane. I soon found myself being charged extra at the hotels, and the porters, newsboys, and booth blacks were charging about double. I asked the newsboy why he did it. "Oh," he said, looking at my cane, "you men can afford it, and you don't come around here very often." I hurried to Chicago for fear I would run out of money, put the cane in the closet, and have never carried it since. In another city, Mr. Moody said to me, "There seems to be something out here of the ordinary, obstructing the work and hindering a great blessing." I found out the next day that the town had a considerable number of free thinkers or theoretical infidels, and they were out at the meetings to see Mr. Moody, as they said, hypnotize the converts. I told him of the state of things. Always very earnest in his seasons of prayer in his room before the meetings. That night he was even more so than ordinary. His burden of heart seemed to be very great. He preached with great earnestness and then called for all who desired to stay for the after meeting. Nearly the whole congregation remained. He came down from the platform to get nearer to the inquirers. He began to instruct them, and in a little while got upon a chair to get a better view of his audience and launched out in a most wonderful discourse. His invectives against sin and lashing of the conscience were awful. All his resources of apt scripture quotation and illustrations were at perfect command. He seemed to be wrestling with an unseen power and might have made a good picture of Elijah on Carmel. I saw men whose faces grew pale under conviction of conscience. Then he began with the wooings of the gospel in a strain of tender and heartbreaking entreaty, and before he was through, the whole audience seemed to be completely broken. one man arose and said, "Mr. Moody, I want to be a Christian." It seemed but a moment after that when 40 or 50 men were on their feet making a similar declaration. The only time I ever saw Mr. Moody make a comment on any of his sermons was that night when he said, "Thank God for that victory." When Mr. Moody came to know William Thaw of Pittsburgh and his broad generosity in giving to all kinds of good work, he was greatly impressed. He once went to him to ask for $10,000 for a school. Mr. Thaw told him that he had changed his method of giving. In place of large sums, he preferred to give more frequently and in lesser sums, and to a greater number of objects. Then his usual gifts ranged from $50 to $500 in each case. "But I will make an exception to you and give you $5,000, he said. Mr. Moody replied, "I am a very busy man, Mr. Thaw, and I can hardly see how I can find the time to come and see you once a month or so to get another $5,000 in smaller installments." Mr. Thaw was so greatly amused at this idea of Mr. Moody that he gave him the whole amount at once. Elijah was one of Mr. Moody's ideal characters, but Elijah under the juniper tree was to him the very reverse. But once did I see him when he seemed to be cast down. In the place where he was holding meetings, someone had insidiously circulated a false report that he was making a great amount of money out of his work. He heard about it and was greatly disturbed him. He said, "I have a notion to take the train and to go home. I think I can suffer almost anything but this." I told him that I felt confident that not a single Christian man in the place gave credence to such a report for a moment. He said to me, "If the committee or anyone else asks how much I charge, tell them not 1 cent. If they are offering anything for me, refuse to take it." The false report, however, only served to adequate the people of the place with the fact that the great financial burdens were resting on Mr. Moody in the education of hundreds of young men and women, and the offerings in that place were very generous. And when they presented to him, it was with the distinct understanding that the people knew of his burden and wanted to help him bear it. Mr. Moody frequently showed his high appreciation of music, especially of vocal music, and the prominence given to praise in all his services was an evidence of this. Few people knew, however, that he had absolutely no musical ear, being unable to distinguish one tune from another. Paradoxical as it may appear, no one really readily detected any difficulty in singing or appreciate more highly a well-trained chorus. His use of music in his services was most effective. The singing had a great and at times overpowering religious value. Before the evangelists arose, the throngs were often touched and persuaded. A great number of cases came to be known in which the monumentous decision for Christ was actually made during the singing. Never was a more thoughtless criticism uttered than that Moody used music merely to attract. In an attempt to present the man's characteristics from all sides and points of view, as an evangelist, an American, a citizen, a director, a friend, and father, it has been impossible to do more than touch upon what was most apparent to his friends. But the keynote of the whole is struck in the following anecdote, which appeared in the Youth's Companion. A young missionary far in the interior of China received for baptism a little child. The name given was Moody, so unusual a combination that the minister asked its origin. "I have heard of your man of God, Moody," was the reply. "In our dialect, Mo means love, and D, God. I would have my child, too, love God." Mr. Moody knew no Chinese, but his name alone told in that language the secret of his life.